Welcome to Tech Talk. I'm Katarina Wallin-Bureau. I lead strategic relations at Microsoft European Government Affairs. Today I'll be talking with Fredrik Erixon, a fellow Swede and the founding director of the European Centre for International Political Economy. Our conversation will focus on one of the most hotly debated topics right now in Europe, namely competitiveness, and how Europe can accelerate technology adoption to drive economic growth. Fredrik, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
AI is transformative technology that can significantly boost Europe's competitiveness. How can the EU help create an environment that fosters innovation and technological advancement?
I think there are lots of things that the EU could do if we talk about the EU as the machinery in Brussels and the European Union institutions. It can, for instance, do what it's doing right now, which is to help to drive investments into supercomputers and to make sure that there is a data infrastructure that is helpful to some countries that may not have the resources to invest in all these things themselves. It can help to generate much more human capital, to help to make sure that European universities get better funding to do frontier research into artificial intelligence, and then of course also to train different type of staff that is going to work in companies and organizations where AI is going to be used. I think the number one thing for the European Union is to make sure that the framework conditions in the economy is good, to make sure that when you want to invest in Europe and go from one European country to another European country, it's going to be a seamless transition. You're not going to be confronted with lots of different bureaucracy, lots of different red tape or administration rules that may have the impact that you're just not going to do that investment. You're not going to do that jump from going from one country to another. So focusing on the framework conditions, have a regulatory framework which is conducive to technological change, that, you know, it's not sort of avoiding difficult questions around technological change, but at the essence takes a positive view, tries to embrace it, encourage people to experiment with technology.
You've previously said innovation delayed is innovation denied. In fact, you've written a book on the importance of innovation-led growth called The Innovation Illusion. Why is the pace of technology adoption so important for competitiveness?
If you take a very long perspective on things like economic growth or generational prosperity in a society, you're going to see that in the long term, the pace of change and the volume of positive change, the more richer we get as society, will be crucially dependent on technological change and our capacity to raise what we economists call productivity growth, that we use resources in a smarter way so we can concentrate also resources on other things. So in the long perspective, the pace of technological change will define how richer we become as societies. So that's the first part of it. The second part is that when you're trying to catch up on a development, so you were not the first part of the world that developed the technology or that ran with the technology and changed how markets and societies work, you need to catch up. And when you're catching up, it's very, very important that you catch up fast, that you're trying to reduce that period to being as short as it possibly can be, because when you catch up and let's say you start to make the investment in technology and start to use technology that other regions in the world have already done, when you've caught up with them where they were at that point, they will also have moved on. So I use, for example, this discussion which has been going on in different parts of the world with some companies are denying the products to go into the European market right now. And we know there are a couple of big brands in the world that have not, they have decided not to introduce new models of the technologies in Europe. And for some people in Europe, they've been commenting on, oh, well, they're going to come here in 2 years. And they probably are. I mean, in 2 years' time, it's most likely that Europeans will have access to the technologies that are now being released in a country like, say, Singapore or Taiwan or United States or Australia. But in 2 years' time, that technology will also have changed, and those other countries in the world will have gone in a different direction, which means that even if you ultimately get your access to the technology, the pace means that others have also moved on their own right and on their own volition, and they're going to be somewhere else, and perhaps be somewhere else where the benefits of technological change will have become even stronger. This we know from a lot of technological shifts in history. If you look at the introduction of the automobile, the combustion engine, if you look at the expansion of vast electricity systems and how that started to power households and factories in different ways, that the pace of change is tremendous important, because if you're not moving at the same speed as others, the likelihood that you're going to become even sort of further behind where the frontier countries are gets actually even bigger.
The European Centre for International Political Economy recently published a paper on the importance of technology diffusion for embedding new technologies into society and for sustaining industrial competitiveness. What are the most significant barriers to technology diffusion within the EU, and how do you think they can be overcome?
So there are lots of different barriers around. Some of these are highly natural barriers. I mean, if you take sort of the most obvious example is going to be language. The fact that we have many different languages, which means it's going to cost a lot more to introduce, say, a technology in many different markets, because you need to come with different descriptions of how to use the technology. You need to have different training programs for organizations that are going to use the technology, etc. You may need to set up maintenance and service centers in lots of different localities in ways that you wouldn't need to do it if we all spoke one language. So it's a pretty obvious one. But if that is the challenge you have, I think you need to focus even more to avoid that you have lots of official policies, public policies, that they are become a hinder or a barrier for you to actually spread technology in the economy. And here I think is the number one issue for Europe, and especially if you compare Europe to an economy like the United States. We have a disproportionate number of small and medium-sized enterprises. When you compare the share of the economy represented by them and you compare them to other regions of the world, you're going to find that we rely much more on them. They are the ones that have the most difficulties in accessing frontier technologies that are happening. If you take the big brands in Europe, either sort of in terms of the biggest companies in terms of size or the most tech-intensive companies, they can, any given a day, a week, they can start to work with frontier technology. The problem is that diffusion, getting it out to all the other companies and all the other organizations and societies that also need to do it in order to make sure that the economy works with smart technology, it can grow faster. So the barrier is mostly about diffusing into SMEs. We know that that requires a lot more focus on having an integrated services market in Europe. We've talked about single market for services for ages, but it hasn't really happened. And since many of these SMEs are going to be services companies, it becomes an even bigger challenge to make sure that we break down these barriers, to make sure that the diffusion pace is also coming into SMEs with the services sector profile. If Europe would do that, it would start to have productivity growth rates which are similar to the ones in America.
How do you think the current digital regulations in the EU impact innovation and productivity? And are there any changes that you think are needed?
I think there are lots of changes that are needed. What we've seen for quite some time now is the accumulation of a really significant stock of regulations in Europe that have impacts on technologies, what you can do with technologies, how can you experiment and invent technology, but also how can you take technologies to consumers and how can you try to disrupt different type of markets in order to get the economy to work better. So we have been extraordinarily active in the European Union in trying to regulate left, right and center on all these aspects of the economy. When you begin to accumulate all this up and count this up, you're going to find that Europe is vastly more regulated than other parts of the world. So the question here is, so where is the balance between innovation and regulation? I don't know. I don't think anyone else knows what the sort of perfect sweet spot is going to be here. But what we do know is that if you're trying to catch up on where other frontier economies in the world are, you're probably not making a wise decision if you're going to regulate this sector much more than happens in other parts of the world. And I think this is the fundamental challenge which also many parts of Europe is confronted with now, that you may have a shift in the overall stance in technology regulation, not just in America, but also other parts of the world, which is going to reduce the burden of regulations for technology companies or for those that are using technologies at the same time as Europe doesn't do it. And if you're going to find sort of that the discrepancy between regulatory burdens in Europe compared to other parts of the world, if that's going to exacerbate even further, then I think it's going to be very, very difficult for Europe to catch up and to start to become leaders again in different type of sectors that are highly tech intensive and that work with frontier technologies in order to bring about new products, new services, and new type of markets.
You've raised concerns about the rise of what you call technology protectionism. So how should Europe balance its desire for technological sovereignty with the need to access global digital infrastructure?
I don't like the word technology sovereignty myself. I think it's laden with sort of a mental framework of how we think about the world and our relations to it, which I think is not good. And I think the problem with technology sovereignty is also that, well, Europe is not a sovereign, but we have lots of member states that are sovereign. So the process that we're setting in motion can also have the effect that you start to break up Europe and European markets, in the sense that each and every country would like to be sovereign on their own. They don't want to rely on another country, even if it's a European Union members, for the supply of different technologies. And I think this is what we're seeing right now, that there's too much fragmentation going on in Europe, that you're careful about relying, for instance, on a cloud solution which comes from country X, or you think that the suppliers of that technology for country Y is not reliable. You're not exactly sure about whether you can sort of fully trust that you will be continue to be supplied with it if sort of big problems are going to emerge. But the main point here is that if you want to build up your own capabilities, you want to create your own capacity to shape an outcome, which is where Europe is going to be a region that is going to lead on technological change, that you're going to find that there are inventors, there are universities, that are companies that are at the frontier of breaking through with these technologies. What I think we need to do is to focus much more on our R&D capacity, focus much more on making sure that universities continue to graduate top researchers that have an interest to stay in Europe and to work with companies and organizations in Europe, and not sort of migrate to other places in the world where the excitement may be bigger about these technologies. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to focus on infrastructure and infrastructure capabilities. A lot of the changes that are going to happen in technology, not just in digital technology, but other technologies too, require vast investments in digital infrastructures. And even if Europe 20 years ago was the leading region in the world in the rollout of new telecom capabilities, we are not that anymore. We are not even at the top 10 list if we put Europe as one unit and compare to the rest of the world. So much more in technological infrastructure. And finally, I think we need to understand that we need to offer much better framework conditions overall for doing business in Europe. And that also is important in light of Europe having a regulatory framework which is much more burdensome, which constrain companies much more, which constrain inventors and those who experiment with technologies even more. So if we're going to continue with that, we need to offer something else. And I think that something else could be a lot better tax incentives for R&D, that we're going to become much more Irish in our way of trying to attract foreign direct investments to come to Europe. FDI in Europe has declined remarkably over the last 5 years. So it's not just about traditional policies like sort of 5G networks or 6G networks or broadbands, or about sort of focusing on R&D budgets at universities. It's also about these framework conditions on how to do business in this society. Is it a friendly attitude or is it not? And if we do that, our chances for success is going to increase remarkably.
So what role does human capital play in technology diffusion and competitiveness? And how can the EU address the skills gap to effectively leverage AI?
Human capital is the number one issue. I mean, when we say we want to be sort of a leader in technology, what we're saying is that we want the smartest people on this earth to be in Europe and start to invent technology, to have sort of breakthroughs in science, to experiment with different types of technologies. We want them to do that here in Europe, and that requires that they want to be in Europe and that we are educating and we are providing good enough conditions so they want to stay. So this is a fundamental issue, and it's also an area where we do have problems right now. Universities in Europe are still churning out a lot of good graduates in computer engineering, in AI-focused competences, but we have a net outflow of human capital in Europe. So we may educate them, but they're going to work somewhere else in the world. And they're probably doing it because if you want to be where the real excitement is in terms of frontier breakthroughs in AI or in quantum or in cloud, you probably need to go to a different part of the world because that future is not happening here, at least not to the same degree as it does it in other parts of the world. So, but it's sort of a policy to keep them is not, in that sense, then very different from a policies of attracting investments or attracting other forms of actors that we need to come to Europe or to stay in Europe if that's where you come from. So we need to do that. But more specific to what you're saying is much larger R&D investments into university, focus these R&D investments into the key subjects and the key disciplines that we know are going to sort of be part of the scientific discourse that will lead to these changes. And that, of course, is going to be a lot of classic STEM subjects, making sure that we have universities that are capable to compete with global leaders. And finally, much more to focus on basic training in schools, basic training at universities, even if you're not going for a degree in any subject which may be close to sort of frontier technological change, to still be capable of interacting with technology and exploring technologies in a way that is going to take your capacity as an individual to be sort of constructive and contribute to organizational change in much better ways. I know many of these issues, they aren't classic EU issues, but there are a lot of coordinations that can be done. There's a lot of best practice transfer of knowledge that can be done. There's a lot of collaborations that they can facilitate between universities, between countries, to make sure that this is going to be much, much more of a smooth and seamless process going forward.
Looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest opportunities and challenges for the EU to have a competitive edge in the global market?
Technology is always going to change, and what we should do is to try to look around the corner and look at the next big things. There's no point for Europe trying to come up with ways to compete with producing the best mobile phones again, or trying to deliver a competitor to an iPad or an iPod, because that's all technologies, and technologies have moved on. But there are lots of things happening, for instance, in the quantum space, in biotechnology, in material science, in space and satellites, where there is a good ground in Europe to build on. And we know that there will be fundamental technological change happening in all these sectors and all these sciences, plus many more in the future. Clean tech, nuclear energy, nuclear science more generally. Focus much more our resources into that, rather than trying to sort of compete with companies that we just can't compete with them. So much more focus towards the future, allocate resources to be able to define that future, rather than just to feel that you're a perennial loser when you're not as competitive in all the technologies.
Thank you, Fredrik. We look forward to continuing our discussion with you on these topics.
Thank you, and likewise.